Hey everybody, welcome back to Race of History. We're going to get into part 5 of the Great Northern War documentary. Sorry that I've been a little bit slow getting videos up the last couple of days. I have been extremely busy with something that came up, but everything's good now. I should be back on schedule. So we're going to do this today, part 5 of the Great Northern War. Let's get into it.
The Battle of Poltava marked the turning point in the Great Northern War. The Swedes, who were on the offensive for the majority of the last decade, were left with the difficult task of defending their empire without their elite army. The Russians, finally out from the shadow of their earlier defeats, were at liberty to attack in all directions without the worry of a powerful opposing army. The rest of Sweden's enemies would not sit idle at this opportunity either. The conflict was far from over, and although Sweden's military might was crippled, they would not go down without a fight. Peter's reforms changed Russia militarily, socially and economically, while the reforms proposed by the sponsor of this Pt.5/Kings. Peter left Poltava for Kiev shortly after the surrender of the Swedish army at Perevalojna. Once there, he sent letters throughout the continent, describing the details of the battle and his complete victory. Europe was left in complete shock. Until that moment, they had only received news of continuous Swedish victories. The Duke of Marlborough famously wrote, "We have no confirmation as yet of the battle between the Swedes and the Muscovites, but should it be true of the first being so entirely beaten as is reported, what a melancholy reflection it is that after constant success for 10 years, Charles XII should in 2 hours' mismanagement and ill success ruin himself and his country." The rest of Europe's elite had a similar
Dang, that's a rough quote.
Disposition towards the Russian victory. However, some welcomed Russia onto the European stage. The famous polymath and philosopher Leibniz remarked that Peter would now be the Turk of the North. Charles himself only avoided capture by sacrificing the majority of his elite army and his most trusted commanders. Though Russian forces pursued the Swedish king, they could not catch him before he crossed the Bug and entered Ottoman territory. Sultan Ahmed III prepared a camp for Charles and his followers at Bender, and they would settle there for the time being. Peter was elated because of his grand victory, yet he was also equally disappointed due to Charles and Mazeppa's escape into Ottoman lands. Wasting no time, the Tsar entered diplomatic talks with Augustus of Saxony, Frederick of Denmark, Frederick William of Prussia, and George I of Hanover. The victorious Russian army was subsequently split in two. Sheremetev would move north towards the Baltic, while Menshikov would advance west into Poland. Stanisław, whose position in Poland was already negligible, saw his royal authority erode completely after the defeat of the Karolian army. Augustus repudiated the Treaty of Altenstadt and advanced into Poland with an army. The magnates of the Commonwealth, either out of dislike towards Stanisław or fear of Russian aggression, began endearing themselves to their former monarch and offered him the crown once again. Left without any alternative, Stanisław joined the Swedish forces in their retreat to Pomerania and then abdicated. To compensate him for the lost crown, Charles granted him the Principality of Zweibrücken and named him Count Palatine. King once again, Augustus met Peter on the 9th of October at Turin. He feared Peter's reaction to having been abandoned in 1706. However, the Tsar did not hold a grudge. Nevertheless, at dinner, Peter could not resist an ironic thrust at Augustus's faithlessness. "I always wear the cutlass you gave me," Peter said, "but it seems you do not care for the sword I gave you, as I see you are not wearing it." Augustus replied that he prized Peter's gift, but that somehow in the haste of his departure from Dresden, he had left it behind. "Ah," said Peter, "then let me give you another." He gave Augustus the same sword he had given him before, which had been discovered in Charles's baggage at Poltava. The monarchs signed a new treaty that effectively made the Commonwealth a Russian dependency in all but name. The Russians were allowed to station their troops in the Commonwealth. Peter would become the guarantor of the rights of the Polish nobility. while Augustus would join all of Peter's wars.
Yeah, and this is interesting because you go from, there's always kind of been this push and pull with Russia historically of kind of whether to modernize and become part of the West or hold on to the tradition, isolation, autocracy, everything that is, kind of historically Russian. And you see that play out over time under different rulers. But Peter specifically really tries to push into kind of the European theater, the European region of the globe, and make Russia essentially a European power, right? He wants trade with Europe. He's just constantly pushing to kind of connect more with the West.
One secret clause of the treaty was that Augustus would be allowed to claim Livonia. In the following days, Peter also established alliances with the Danes and the Prussians, who would enter the war again by the end of 1709. A large Danish army landed in Scania at the beginning of 1710. Alarmed at the prospect of an attack on mainland Sweden, a 15,000-strong army was raised by Magnus Stenbock. At the Battle of Helsingborg in March, the Swedish army decisively defeated their Danish counterpart.
The Danes really have a rough go here.
This effectively marked the last time that the Danish tried to reclaim Scania.
I feel like once a video almost through this whole series, Denmark has been getting their teeth kicked in.
Augustus was consolidating his power in the Commonwealth for most of 1710, and the Danish were rebuilding their armies at the same time. The western front of the war went through a lull for most of the year. The same cannot be said for the eastern Baltic, though. Sweden's Baltic ports remained relatively undefended now that the Karolian army had capitulated. In July, Riga, Sweden's richest and most populous city, surrendered to the Russians after negotiating the restorations of old privileges for the Livonian nobility. According to the Treaty of Turin, Riga was supposed to be handed over to Augustus. However, the topic seemingly never resurfaced again. Dunamunda and Pernau fell in August, while Arensberg and Revel capitulated in September. In March of the same year, Viborg had been besieged too. Suffering from a lack of supplies and artillery, the Russian army was unable to assault the well-defended fortress. Finally, after several months, Peter arrived with his new fleet, bringing his army much-needed food and weapons. The massive Russian artillery barrages breached the walls within a few days, and the Swedish garrison quickly surrendered. With this, Peter had finally achieved one of his main personal goals: to form a powerful defensive corridor around his capital, St. Petersburg.
Yeah, you see that Peter is really pushing to first build, then strengthen, then continuously defend St. Petersburg. Like, that is the crown jewel for Peter, right? It's his corridor to the west. It's his beautifully built city. Like, it is his crown jewel. A lot of what he does is centered around it specifically, looking directly at St. Petersburg and what would be best for it.
The Russians led several offensives into Finland during the next 2 years. However, due to logistical issues, they were unsuccessful. No sooner had Charles taken refuge in the Ottoman Empire, Peter had begun sending letters to the Sultan, requesting the Swedish king's extradition. These letters became increasingly threatening as the months passed, much to the annoyance of Ahmed. Taking the last of Peter's letters as a personal insult, the Sultan declared war on Russia in October of 1710. The Tsar was still under the impression of his victory at Poltava, and this prompted him to enter the war with a much smaller army than the Ottoman one, relying only on the support of Moldavia and Wallachia. This war, known as the Pruth Campaign, ended in a swift defeat for the Russians, with Peter himself only avoiding being captured due to the incompetence of the Ottoman Grand Vizier. The subsequent Pruth Treaty stipulated, among other things, that Peter would allow Charles free passage to Sweden. Charles...
Yeah, terrible move, in my opinion. This is such a short-sighted view by the Ottomans to not just crush the army and take Peter, negotiate with him as a hostage. I don't know, anything except just letting them go.
Would not use that right, however, instead choosing to remain in the Ottoman Empire to try and persuade the Sultan to attack Russia again. In 1711, the Allied forces began a massive offensive into Swedish Pomerania, besieging the fortresses of Stralsund, Stettin and Wismar. But since the armies were more interested in raiding the countryside, the sieges were not effective. Additionally, disagreements between the commanders and a lack of siege artillery ensured that nothing of note would be achieved. In September, Stenbock landed on the island of Rügen with a large army. Alarmed at the prospect of facing a strong Swedish army, the Allied forces retreated from Stralsund and Stettin. As the Allies were insufficiently strong to take such well-garrisoned cities, they remained content with sporadic raids on smaller settlements. In the spring of 1712, another strong Swedish army arrived in Stralsund. Consequently, the Danish navy began tightening its grip over the Baltic Sea, which worsened the situation for the defenders of the Swedish forts. Stenbock knew that Stralsund would not survive a combined land and sea-based blockade. However, facing the combined Danish-Saxon-Russian army was not a feasible option either. In autumn, the Allied forces split up into two, so that one part could raid Mecklenburg. Stenbock's options were now to face a large Russian-Saxon army south of Stralsund, or to head west into Mecklenburg and fight the Danish.
This is probably what most people expected at the beginning of the war, right? When everybody in the alliance kind of decided they were going to team up against Sweden, everybody probably thought this is what the war would look like. It just so happened that it didn't, and Sweden, roughed everybody up for a handful of years when it first started. But now the Swedish economy is struggling. The king is, in Ottoman territory, having just lost the majority of his army, and they're kind of scrambling to get their footing. And it looks more like probably what people expected.
In the end, he decided on the latter option. Peter was in Dresden at the time, recovering from an illness. He was already furious because of the lack of coordination between the Allied commanders, and after hearing of Stenbock advancing towards Mecklenburg, he ordered his forces to engage in a pursuit without him. Stenbock advanced quickly, much faster than the Russian-Saxon armies did. On the 3rd of December, the Danish army encamped for winter quarters southwest of Wismar, near the town of Gadebusch. The Swedish army arrived at Wernau on the 14th, and by the 18th they were already at Brusewitz, merely 10 kilometers away from the Danish army. At that point, the Russian army was south of Lake Schwerin and could not provide any assistance. Only a small Saxon cavalry detachment arrived to aid the Danish by the eve of the battle. Stenbock knew that any delay would be detrimental to his cause, so he marched his army through a snowstorm, arriving on the other side of the river on the morning of the 20th. Jobst von Schultens, the leader of the Danish army, placed his forces behind a river and dense marshland near the village of Falkenstedt. The strong Danish defensive position made their leaders believe that the Swedes would turn south and try to cross the river at a safer point before attacking.
I can see why they would think that. The layout is essentially that if you attack straight ahead, you're really going into the teeth of the defenses, and you are in your most vulnerable spot if you are attacking. So the idea that they would try to maneuver to one side or the other to not just go head to head against this defensive setup, it's what I would think is the logical course of action. Of course, I say that the Swedes have done this like 5 times since this series started, where I look at the layout of defensive positioning and I'm like, okay, well, the last move here would be to attack it head on, and then they go bust through and attack it head on. So maybe if I'm holding down the defenses and I've fought Sweden continuously since this war started, I would think maybe there's a chance that they come head on at us.
Reconnaissance, however, Stenbock concluded that their only chance of victory would be through a full frontal assault. The Allied army was around 17,000 strong, with 8,000 Danish infantrymen, 5,000 cavalry, along with another 4,000 Saxon horsemen. The Swedish army had about 12,500 men, with 6,500 footmen and 6,000 cavalry. Both sides placed their infantry in the center and their cavalry on the flanks. The Swedes had 30 cannons.
Are those guns in front of the Swedes? Golly, throughout this entire war, it's like they didn't even believe in artillery. And now they've got 30 guns with them.
While the Danish had 14. Jobst von Scholten led the Danish.
Wow! Not only did they bring artillery, they outnumber the artillery of the army they're facing. Has that happened yet in any of the battles of this war? That the Swedish artillery has outnumbered whoever they're facing? That's crazy.
Army, Jakob von Flemming led the cavalry on the left flank. Stenbock led the Swedish army. At 1 p.m, the Swedish artillery opened fire and the rest of their troops advanced. The Swedes were using a new type of cannon, which was more mobile and precise than the Danish artillery. Their artillery barrage not only managed to cover the advance of their troops, but also dealt heavy casualties to the Danish forces. The Swedish infantry advanced towards the Danish position through a narrow clearing. Adhering to the Karolian tactics, they advanced until they could discern their enemy's facial features and fired several devastating volleys. The Danish infantry returned fire, however it was not precise. Scholtens attempted to break the Swedish center with a cavalry attack from the right. This attack failed due to precise Swedish volleys, as well as artillery barrages, and the cavalry retreated after suffering significant casualties. Afterwards, the Swedish left attacked the winded Danish right. This forced Scholten to wheel his entire army to the left to avoid being out.
What? That seemed like such a dumb move, to send a cavalry contingent to attack the Swedish center. Because you're not just sending a cavalry contingent, you're sending your flank. And so if they aren't successful, that puts you at a huge disadvantage. I don't know, that seems really, really dicey and dangerous to me.
Outflanked. Simultaneously, the Swedish cavalry on the right managed to find a small path through the marsh and attacked. The Danish left was caught completely by surprise and began retreating because of the relentless Swedish assault. The Allied army, though in a strong defensive position, was suffering from disorganization. Flemming, the leader of the Danish forces on the left, requested that the cavalry which was kept behind Wackenstedt be brought to the front on the morning of the battle. Scholten acquiesced, however his order came in late and those cavalry regiments were caught behind the Danish left during the retreat. As they were unprepared for battle and caught in a position where maneuvering was difficult, disorder broke loose within their ranks. They were pushed back to Wackenstedt, where brutal fighting ensued. The quick and precise Swedish assault along the entire front pushed the Danish army back and some units began routing. Unable to save their left flank, Flemming and Scholtens retreated behind Wackenstedt and formed a new defensive line there. The Swedish left once again assaulted the Danish right. However, they were fired upon by the Danish Royal Guard and lost some of their momentum. Nevertheless, the Danish right almost broke, and Flemming had to reinforce it with his Saxon cavalry. The Saxons managed to stabilize the line. However, their attempts to push the Swedes back were unsuccessful. The Royal Guard still continued firing at the Swedish cavalry, causing many casualties. This forced Stenbock to send his elite infantry regiments to fight them, and the two sides engaged in a brutal melee. This engagement was eventually won by the Swedes, and the Danish centre began to retreat. The Saxons, though unable to defeat the Swedish left, fought fiercely and ensured that their enemies could not pursue the retreating forces. Most of the troops on the Danish left were either killed or captured, and only a few soldiers managed to retreat with the rest of the army. In the end, the Danish army lost all of their artillery and about 6,500 men, most of whom were captured, while the Swedes lost 1,500. Although this battle was a tactical success for Stenbock's army, it proved to be strategically insignificant. The Danish army was not completely broken, and the Russians and Saxons still had overwhelming numerical superiority. Furthermore, the Swedish army was no longer within the safety of Stralsund's walls, and marching back would be a risky move. A lack of supplies also began to take its toll on them, and to make matters worse, the Baltic Sea was still frozen, so resupplying by ship was not an option. Stenbock subsequently moved west with his army, trying to extort funds and supplies out of the Danish-controlled city of Altona. When the citizens failed to meet the overwhelming demands, the Swedish army burned the city to the ground. The army headed east afterwards, however, it was surrounded by a large Russian-Saxon force nearby Turning. Breaking his neutrality, Charles Frederick of Holstein-Gottorp provided refuge to the Swedish army inside his fort, as with the Spanish War of Succession nearly over, the Duke expected aid from Great Britain and the United Provinces, just like in 1700. Their ships never arrived, and with hunger and disease running rampant throughout his army, Stenbock surrendered on the 13th of May. Having lost another army, Charles seems to be in dire straits, with defeat being an increasingly realistic option. The Allied powers were more than willing to make peace with Sweden. Charles, adamant that he would not relinquish even an inch of land, refused even the most lenient offers. With the king so headstrong and averse to defeat, it became evident.
Yeah, that's just brutal. Because I don't know, like, if you're a Swede here, or, you know, especially if you're like if you're a part of the government, or if you are a noble or something like that, I can't imagine that you're taking this well. You're looking at all of this chaos and destruction of armies, of, you know, the economic situation, of everything, and the king just still wants to fight. I don't know. I just feel like that would be a hard pill to swallow.
Evident that war-weary Sweden would not sue for peace, at least not while Charles XII was still breathing. Our next episode will see the conclusion of the Great Northern War, so make sure you are subscribed and have pressed the bell button. Please consider liking, commenting and sharing, it helps immensely. Our videos would be impossible with...
Okay, so that was part 5, I believe, of the Great Northern War series by Kings and Generals. That was a good one. The Swedes, man, they're just... I feel like their military doctrine is just so counter to most military doctrine that you read and see that it looks really bizarre and kind of funny whenever you see it play out the way that it does. But yeah, that was a good one. I'll get to the next one tomorrow. As always, like, comment, subscribe. Help me keep building the channel over here. I will see you all next time.